discipline. Have some discipline.
You're listening to Hart Beat Radio.
Bob Johnson coming to you live from the Hart Beat Radio studios, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And what a great show we're going to have for all the fans of Hart Beat Radio this afternoon. A very lovely lady that I met down at the Lou Thesz, George Strago's Hall of Fame this summer, the widow of the world's greatest wrestler of all time, Lou Thesz, Charlie Thesz. And I'm going to bring Charlie on in a couple of minutes. But before that, I'd like to introduce our regular co-host from Portland Wrestling, Mr. Matt Merz.
Always a pleasure to be here, Bob. I'm looking forward to tonight's show. I know there's a lot of great guests coming up in the future, but I don't want to spoil that because we have an amazing guest today.
Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the man of the hour, the man with the power, trainer, booker, what can you say, my friend Bruce Hart. Welcome back to Hart Beat Radio.
Yeah, it's a real honor for me to do a show on Lou Thesz. I was fortunate in being able to meet Lou when I was a little kid, and later on when I was booking Stampede Wrestling, my dad brought Lou up for one of the big shows. It was a real honor. It kind of gave me goosebumps. We did a few road trips that week, and everybody, myself included, spent most of the trip just asking Lou questions about anything and everything we could about the old days with Strangler Lewis and the old NWA and Sam Muchnick and all the great workers that Lou had a chance to work with and all the legends that he was involved with.
On the line, I have president of the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, Mr. Johnny Mantell. Welcome back to Hart Beat Radio, Johnny.
Well, Bob and Bruce, thank you so much for having me today, and it's always an honor to be on the air with you two, and the Hart family's always been so kind to myself and my family, and, the history of this sport is so important because without the history, we don't know where we've been, and we're not really sure where we're going, and I think a lot of people feel that way today, but
somebody should tell Vince McMahon and Triple H that hopefully they maybe make note of that important.
Well, and I think too by paying attention to history and you told your story about Lou and I had the real privilege and honor of getting to meet Lou Thesz and actually got an opportunity to wrestling in 1978 in Jackson, Mississippi for George Calkin and Frankie Kane. Lou Thesz came in. George had pulled away from Tri-State or Mid-South Wrestling, Leroy and Bill Watts, and had opened up his own territory for about 2 years. And Frankie Kane was their booker, and Lou came through there and worked with a few of us young guys that were in that territory at that time. And it was sort of like an E.F. Hutton moment in the dressing rooms at night. When he would talk, it was like an audience of Boy Scouts sitting around the scout leader telling those stories.
I remember Lou was always so generous with his advice, and he never talked down to you or anything like that, but he was a wealth of information, and it gives you a lot more perspective and maybe insight into, the business and all the legacy and the heritage and all of that, So for that reason,
I'll never forget that in 1978, one night with a very young Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy.
Oh yeah, the Freebird, yeah.
And James Harris, later on Kamala.
The big black guy, yeah.
Yeah. The manager, Sugar Bear, the manager Percy Pringle, who later became Paul Bear. We're all in the dressing room one night in Greenville, Mississippi, and again, Lou's got our attention and telling us some story and things, and he looked around the room and he sort of stood up and he said, "I'm going to tell all you young guys something tonight. That if you don't protect this business, someday it's going to become choreographed tumbling." And I've never forgot that. I didn't understand it that night.
Probably a tactful way. I know my dad and a few others had a less diplomatic word for it, but
Well, I'll never forget it because he said it in such a way that we all sort of scratched our head and didn't really comprehend what he was really talking about that night, but it always stuck with me.
Without any further ado, welcome to Hart Beat Radio, Charlie Thesz.
Well, I thank you. It is fun to be here because Lou is my favorite subject. So ask any questions, and I do want to comment on the choreographed tumbling. That was an expression that began with Lou in Mexico because that's what it was in Mexico. It was choreographed tumbling.
Yeah, I think the Mexicans were the first. I had a lot of them I crossed paths with up back in the 70s, and that was always the big knock on Mexico is they used to call them combinaciones, which was sort of their word for choreographed and
combinations. Yes.
Yeah, and they'd have some good spots, but there was no rhyme or reason, and it was always the fans even barely had a chance to catch their breath, and they'd be off into the next series of high spots. And guys like Lou and my dad and guys from that era were disdainful of that, if only because there was no wrestling involved. It was just sort of like choreographed gymnastics or whatever, And
I will have to say this about Lou. As wrestling changed, he never resented it. He felt like he had his time to do his thing, and he didn't feel he needed to force his vision of pro wrestling on the younger guys. And that was something that really amazed me because he loved wrestling so much, and he loved Mexico. We had the best time, and I have to tell one of my favorite stories, and you guys who have been to Mexico, you know how this goes. You drive forever and ever to this little tiny town, and the arena is filled with people, and Lou was like always the last match. And it came time for the last match, and of course I'm ready for the matches to be over so I can go back to the hotel, and it just drug on, and Scorpion came out, and he's doing this big drama, and he's revving up the fans, and I'm going, what in the world? Let's just get it over with. Lou comes out in the shoes of Frankenstein, and I don't know whose trunks, but the whole story behind it was Lou thought one of the guys had put his bag in the car. The guy thought Lou had put his bag in the car, so Lou got to the matches with no trunks, no shoes. So they're having, because Frankenstein was before Lou, and the only one with size 12 feet, they had to keep the crowd going while Frankenstein got out of his shoes and Lou got into them. I mean, it was a night to remember to see Lou Thesz pigeon-toed in those, 1-inch soles of the Frankenstein monster. It was just a riot. But Mexico, for all of the choreographed tumbling, was always exciting. And the people there, the most wonderful.
I was down with Stu and Lou down at Cauliflower Alley, maybe around 1999, 2000, somewhere in there. And I remember Stu and Lou and Danny Hodge and them were just sort of extolling the virtues of what wrestling used to be, and they felt that I think it was Lou said something about in baseball and football they've had some kind of evolutions with artificial turf and
Absolutely.
Some of the. But they said those sports are baseball, still baseball, even if they got designated hitters or whatever, and football, still football, whether they got artificial turf or whatever. But they were saying that they didn't know what the wrestling was, and that they were disappointed that the people that were running it, specifically the WWE, and my dad said he felt that they had taken a lot of needless shortcuts, and my dad said back in the day the wrestlers that were coming up, people like himself and Lou and Danny Hodge, they all had to pay their dues for years in these sweatshops and dungeons and places like that, and that was what made them respect and love the business. You know, they had paid their dues, and they had an implicit respect for the business, and weren't sure that a lot of the guys coming in today had that. You know, they got a push because they maybe were big muscular guys, or they could talk, or they could pretend to be something.
I think Lou lived long enough to understand that he had no control over that he had done his best during his time. And I will never forget the first time he met Kurt Angle. I mean, It's a picture I'll always have in my mind. And Kurt was apologizing to Lou because he'd gone into professional wrestling. And Lou stood there, put his hand on Kurt's shoulder, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Kurt, take the money." And Lou never, ever saw professional wrestling as anything but a business. And that's because of what Ray Steele said to him when he was a kid.
Ray Steele's, he was an old shooter for any of the listeners out there.
If you don't learn to make money, hunky, it's just a hobby. And that stayed with Lou, and he understood. Now, I will say this about modern-day wrestling. He didn't watch it. He would say he was going to, and he would last maybe 5 minutes before it was enough. But that was fine. But he never felt like the guys coming up didn't deserve their chance at whatever they wanted to make of wrestling, because Lou had such a power in his time to change it to what he wanted, that, I mean, he understood that it was a business.
I'd like to, see them maybe learn from, the legacy of a guy like Lou Thesz or Straggler Lewis or Ray Steele, who you mentioned, and Danny Hodge and Stu, guys like that.
Danny is the best. I mean, one of my treasures from my life with Lou. Danny and Dolores are just incredible people. And he has a new facility in Perry, Oklahoma. So that's something we all need to go down and check out. I'm ashamed to say I haven't been yet, but I definitely will. What a credit to the sport of wrestling.
I did visit the park in Perry, Oklahoma, the day they dedicated the statue to Danny Hodge. And it's a park dedicated to the amateur wrestling of Perry, Oklahoma, a little town in Oklahoma that has won 43 state titles in a 90-some year span that they've been given state titles for wrestling in the state of Oklahoma. And it is a fantastic monument to amateur wrestling and to Danny Hodge and his credentials. And the one thing that I really took, and again, I met Lou when I was 19, and I met another old-time wrestler, Dick Steinborn, when I was about 12. And one thing I took from both of them was, and Dick Steinborn actually walked me out in front of the arena in Tampa, Florida, and me out and said, "What's that say up on that marquee, kid?" And I said, "It says Wrestling Tonight." And he says, "That's right. And by God, if that's what it says on the marquee, you better do some when you're in the ring." and that's always stuck with me, because again, I think that's what Lou and Dickie and all these greats that I met, Leo Garibaldi and Don Leo Jonathan and Danny Hodge, and all these greats that I've met and had the privilege of either getting in the ring with or sitting and hearing stories and being told stories, they all said that same thing and that same motif of,
and they all had
you got to wrestle.
They all had a swagger. Not to digress, but I remember any time you ever had Lou or Danny Hodge or any of those guys, whenever they came into the building, they were always wearing a suit and looking professional. And they would always look the part, and people would see them coming into the building, and they'd look up to them, that they were on a higher level, and that was part of that whole genre too, I think.
Yeah, I do too. I think that there's a lost image of, and you know, you can say it's maybe the cauliflower ears or the arms that don't straighten all the way because your elbows hit the mat too many times, or whatever it may be. There was always that image of that tough wrestler walking through the door, and it wasn't a ball or a brawl type fighter that you saw. You saw this athlete, this guy with arms and legs that could use them left or right or left, and they worked holds and they made you believe in what they did, and that was always the way that I interpreted it from a young punk kid coming into the business.
Exactly like you were saying, Johnny, with wrestling tonight. They wrestled. You know, you never see a bunch, 500 chairs under the ring, and guys smashing each other with chairs and sticks, and, timekeeper's table being shattered, and, some diva that was there for no reason other than, aesthetic reasons. You never see any of that back in the day. Even the guys who were sort of an extension of the showbiz now, like at Gorgeous George or whatever, anyone in the business knows that Gorgeous George was actually a pretty good amateur wrestler back in the day, and I know Stu and Lou worked with him many a time, but, he was considered like showbiz, but he actually was a pretty legit amateur and, mostly did wrestling. It was, he just had the look, but...
Professional wrestling is still a very young industry. It's only been around 100 years, a little over 100 years. That allows for a lot of room for things to evolve. You just look at filmmaking and how that has evolved over the years, and maybe it's like that, or maybe it is like vaudeville, where it is just slowly dying. I realize a lot of people out there don't even know what vaudeville is anymore if they're under the age of 50, but maybe wrestling is like that, and it often reminds me of the circus. The circus is all but dead now. But the largest circus in the world doesn't have elephants and it doesn't have grizzly bears. It's Cirque du Soleil. And
yes.
I think there is an interesting parallel there with WWE, because WWE is the only wrestling show under the big top that is still going strong like Cirque du Soleil. Is that a fair comparison? And what are your opinions on that, folks?
Well, I'm gonna step in here, because what most people don't realize is professional wrestling did not come from amateur wrestling. It did not evolve like basketball and football and baseball. Amateur wrestling came from carnivals.
Yes,
professional wrestling came from carnivals. So that was the first evolution, was from the athletic shows and the winner take all and the taking on all comers. So people expect it to be more like baseball and football and basketball, and that it evolved from amateur, and it didn't. And I will have to say some of the young wrestlers that I've met through the Dan Gable Museum have a respect for the history. I really was impressed, and I have to tell you this story about Edge. He was getting the Lou Thesz Award. Usually I do the airport runs because I have a captive audience for an hour and a half. And I was picking up Don Curtis's widow, Dottie, and I couldn't pick up Edge. But I was having breakfast with Danny and Dolores Hodge and Bill Murdoch, who knows Edge, and I said, "Can Danny go to the airport?" And Dolores said, "Well, yes, Bill knew Edge, so I am so proud of myself. I've just gotten in there, manipulated, gotten my way, sent them out to the airport, and then it dawned on me, what if Edge doesn't know who Dan Hodge is?" Now, my heart sank, because that would have been a nightmare for me.
And that's very possible in the 21st century, for people to not know who he is.
And I mean agonized. I was almost ill. So the first moment I had, I called, talked with Dolores, and she said, "Charlie, he is just delightful." She said he kept saying, "I cannot believe Dan Hodge is my chauffeur." I cannot believe Dan Hodge picked me up at the airport. But he had been in Canada filming Haven, and he'd been up for 36 hours. So when they got back to the hotel, he apologized, Adam apologized, said, I have got to go lie down. Danny said, hey, man, I've been there. So he and Danny and Dolores went across the street to Doughy Joey's to have lunch, and Dolores said they had no sooner ordered their lunch till Adam or Edge showed up and said, if I could join you guys. And Danny said, I thought you needed sleep. And he said, I can sleep anytime. How often do I get to spend time with Danny and Dolores Hodge? So, you know, there are guys who do respect the history, who know what they owe, and it was just such a heartwarming experience for me because that museum was Lou's passion, and it's something that I've stayed involved in. And like you guys, you know, it's just that nightmare that the people who built professional wrestling from the carnival up will be left out and be forgotten.
Yeah. I think, you know, some historian once said your future is only as bright as your past, and I think WWE needs to be revisiting. You know, I'm not sure if Lou's even in the WWE Hall of Fame or what. You know, I was down there a few years ago and they inducted my dad, and it really annoyed me that there were so many of these iconic guys from my dad and Lou's era that are not in the Hall of Fame, yet they have all these nondescripts.
The only wrestling Hall of Fame he cares about is the one right here. You talking about it. He doesn't care what Vince has to say, and he and Vince never, he always called him Vinny, never really got along. Lou didn't care about any of that. The reason Lou loved the museum in Iowa and the reason he loved Mike Chapman, who brought it all together, was because it was amateur and professional under the same roof, and Dan Gable was Lou's hero. That's what Lou cared about, what Vinny did or didn't do. And it was funny because Ben called me to let me know they were doing this thing about Lou. I was on a train coming back from New York, and he's explaining all of this to me, which, of course, it's not that I don't care, that I'm not touched, but it is kind of that I don't care and I wasn't touched. But I finally listened to him, and he's talking about the pay-per-view and all of this. And finally I said, Ben, you're not thinking I'm going to buy the pay-per-view, are you? And Ben just broke up laughing. He said, no, Charlie, I'm not thinking that. So I have had a good relationship with a lot of the people from WWE. Jerry Briscoe is phenomenal.
One of our highlights of the room here, of course, is the ring they had made for Lou as he was inducted in the first class here into this Hall of Fame. And unfortunately, he passed, I guess, about a month before the ceremony, so he never came and got that ring. But it is one of the highlights of the room. And this year, our television era class has a gentleman that I read a lot of great comments Lou made about, and that's Luther Lindsay is being inducted this year in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Lou absolutely adored him, said he was one of the finest wrestlers he ever met and one of the finest men. So that is certainly.
I spoke to his daughter the other day, and they are so excited about coming and honoring her father. And
that's Luana and Gertrude.
We are just the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. We don't look at the amateur like Iowa does. We are a little different in that way, but we have stuff all the way dated back to the Civil War. And actually, a group of kids, I got a copy from a newspaper clipping from sometime in the mid-1800s about a young man that moved into town and was working at a stable, and he jumped up into a ring and tried one of those tough guys and beat him. And when the gentleman was leaving the ring, they said, we didn't catch your name. What is your name? And the gentleman said, my name's Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln.
Oh,
so
yes.
to have that kind of history and to tell that kind of history to the kids of today, and I've had 3 kids in today already, young kids that are just getting started in amateur wrestling, and actually the hall here is going to supply a room for the high schools here to start wrestling in the high school. So we're very involved in amateur wrestling and what we're trying to do.
Awesome.
To all of y'all, Happy New Year's and Happy Holidays. Bob, Bruce, thank you guys for having me on. I've got to get running with this group.
Okay,
and
go
Charlie,
get that tour.
Charlie,
thank you.
I will. Charlie and I will get your number and we'll talk on the phone. Thank you so much.
You too.
Now, Charlie, I've got a question that came in on Facebook. There's a great group on Facebook called Old School Pro Wrestling Lives, and the gentleman who runs the group, William Burroughs, wanted me to ask a little bit more about Lou's early days when he was first breaking into the business and how that all came about.
Lou's father, well, Lou had 3 sisters. He was third of 4 children. And so his father, being a true Hungarian European family, Lou had his chores and all the stuff he had to do along with the girls, but his father would take him to the wrestling matches, and he absolutely fell in love with it. And his father had been an amateur wrestler, had dabbled in Greco-Roman in Hungary as a kid, and started working out with Lou and teaching him some of the exercises and the moves. But Lou was fascinated from the first moment he saw it and just would not let it go. And although Lou was not in school because he was working when he was like 15 years old, he was still on the high school wrestling team. See, they didn't have to make grades back then. They didn't even have to go to school to be on the team because he was that good. And he absolutely lived it. And, of course, the turn in his career was Warren Buckwinkle. He was working out with George Tragus, and Warren brought him into the promotion in St. Louis. And Nikki always loved to joke about his dad discovering Lou Thesz, but that was the truth. Warren Buckwinkle was the one that took him down to Tom Patz, the promoter in St. Louis.
Fascinating, Charlie, because I remember when I was a little kid, Warren Buckwinkle worked for my dad. He was up here, and he always had Nicky Buckwinkle, who was kind of, my dad referred to as a young punk at that time, and Nicky was down in the dungeon many a time with Stu and
yes.
And that guy that Johnny just mentioned, Luther Lindsay. They were kind of like the regulars in the dungeon, Luther Lindsay and another old guy that I think Lou knew named George Gordienko, and they were putting these young guys like Nick Buckwinkle through their paces, you know, and it's kind of like my dad used to refer to as stretching them.
I've got a couple of friends of ours on the air right now, and I'd like to welcome Herb, and I understand Larry Matacek is on with you too. Welcome to Hart Beat Radio.
It's an honor, and we're glad to be on here, and I do have Larry here with me today. And it's an honor to sit here and talk with Charlie Thesz. I can't think of a
Oh, my gosh. How are you, Larry? It is so good to hear you.
It's good to hear you, my dear. And it makes me think of Lou, who was, as far as I'm concerned, just the most wonderful personality in professional wrestling. Of course, and I'm not taking anything against Stu Hart there, but I grew up with you.
Well, I might add, my dad echoed that. He loved Lou, and you know,
and it was
he told me that Lou was the ultimate pro wrestler, and my dad always said Lou was the greatest ambassador in the history of pro wrestling. He spread the gospel, and wherever he went, he instilled respect and made people, respect and look up to pro wrestling and pro wrestlers. So my dad always used to say there was too bad there wasn't a lot more Lou Theszes, because the business would be a hell of a lot better if there had been, you know. So wrestling needs a lot more Herb Simmons and Charlie Theszes and Larry Mataceks too. You know, it's precious few of those people in the business today, and it needs more of them too.
Lou's book is no longer in print. Hooker, An Authentic Wrestler's Adventures Inside the Bizarre World of Professional Wrestling. For a used copy on Amazon, it costs $120, and we have a listener interested in. Is it still in print? Where would folks find it at?
There is a new edition at crowbarpress.com. CROWBAR press.com. Scott Teal
appropriately
published
named.
it. Yes, Scott Teal published it. J. Michael
Scott does
Kenyon
amazing work.
edited
He's got a ton of
he
biographies.
does. Oh, he is terrific. But J. Michael Kenyon edited it, much to my chagrin here and there. But I still love J. Michael, and Scott's printing it. Publishing it. So it is available. It has pictures in it now. Really, Scott did an amazing, amazing job. Although he didn't want to put a picture in there of Lou's ex-wife, I insisted. I said, every ordinary girl should know sometimes another ordinary girl gets the hunk. So while his ex-wife was drop-dead gorgeous, I got him. So, but the book has wonderful, wonderful pictures, and it's crowbarpress.com. And you can order it.
The book is
it's
called
still
Hooker.
Still Hooker. Yeah. Thank you so much for asking that.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. And if you want to know something about wrestling as it developed, if you want to know something about wrestling from Lou Thesz' perspective and the things that he went through, it's just a beautifully written book, and I would certainly advise anybody who's serious about this, they need to get a hold of that book and they need to read it because it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
And they should read that Brody biography, too, that Larry worked on with Barbara Goodish. That's another great read.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Lou thought the world of Brody, and it literally broke his heart. It was a horrible day when Lou lost him.
You know, he was Brody had been here for doing an appearance for Herb Simmons right before he went down to Puerto Rico on that trip. So tell him about that, the appearance that Brody made for you.
Yeah, I think one of the highlights, Charlie, I think I may have told you this when he was in Waterloo. Larry had arranged for Brody to come in, and we had several shows, but then he also arranged to have Lou come in and do a special guest referee for us. Yep. And we had this big at the Belleville, Illinois, the big Expo Center Hall where we were running monthly shows. We actually had it all to ourselves prior to the show that night, and they had the Japanese photographers here because Lou and Brody was getting ready to go to Japan for a big thing there.
With the Nokia.
With the Nokia, yeah.
He was involved in the deal.
So I'll never forget they wanted to get in the ring and do a little tussling and some photo ops for the photographers from Japan. And I still remember after Lou and Brody got out of the ring, Brody came over and told Larry, and I said, I got to tell you one thing. When that old timer gets a hold of your arm, you're going wherever he wants you to go.
He says, you can go or you can have something broke. It's your choice. So I guess it's the hard way or the easy way.
Exactly. And Charlie, I wanted to tell you, when you did that little promo video for me up there last year in Waterloo, and when I brought it back and played it for Larry, he got the big smile on his face because he dearly loves Charlie Thesz.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you, Lou would have done anything for Larry. And, of course, so many of the attachments I have originated with Lou. But there are those people like Danny Hodge, like Larry, that will always be special to me, even if Lou had not been in the picture. And I just cannot say enough about the respect and affection that Lou had for Larry. So it's just so good to hear from you. I know I'm the world's worst at keeping in touch, but I think of you often and love you dearly.
Well, we're going to get you back here to St. Louis. I know we've talked about it a couple times, and, our shows are still doing good. We got our first one coming up on the 21st of this month, and the TV show is doing real good. And thanks to people like Bob and Bruce and them, the fans keep voting us as a good independent promotion throughout the country. So I think Lou would be proud of what we're trying to do here in St. Louis.
You guys were talking about St. Louis, and I don't know if Lou ever talked to you about the Businessman Sports Club that was in downtown St. Louis, where when he was probably a teenager, he was wrestling.
Absolutely.
Okay,
and handball, oh my gosh. Where he played handball all the time, yes.
Yep, and that's where he met a lot of the Ray Steele, Strangler Lewis, Sam Muchnick. A lot of those guys came through, and a lot of the baseball players, a lot of the old Gas House gang. And Lou was just a teenager. Obviously, he was just a teenager, and that was like
Dizzy Dean and Joe Garagiola and Stan Musial and those guys, eh?
Sure.
Oh my gosh,
Lou
Stan the man.
One of the greatest pictures I still think we have is a picture of, let's see, it's Lou, Musial, Red Shandy, Joe Lewis, boxing great.
Still have it.
That's
Joe Garagiola. Joe Garagiola's in it. Yep.
What a great picture that is, and it really tells you about the traditional St. Louis sports, and wrestling was part of the sports scene.
And I was told that Sam Muchnick originally was a sports writer. That's sort of how he kind of covered the baseball and kind of became the the promoter in the St. Louis, and Lou was kind of his major franchise player there, from 1948 or whatever and onward, and the foundation of the NWA and all like that all kind of came out of there, so it was kind of fascinating.
Back to baseball, you mentioned Enos Slaughter. Lou and Enos were at a autograph signing thing together, and he kept saying, Lou, let me sign a baseball for you. And Lou said, Enos, I appreciate it, but, I'm just really not into that. He said, well, you've got to know somebody that loves baseball. My mother and my brother were nuts over baseball. So I'm looking at the baseball Enos signed for Lou. It says, to Mother, best wishes, Enos Slaughter. And that's, he had it signed to Mother, my mother, who was 4 years younger, who he called Mother the whole time. It was a scream. My brother had a fit. Who the heck signed a baseball to Mother? But I still have it, guys. I'm sitting here looking at it.
The ball right there. You got the ball right there.
I think all those guys are in Cooperstown.
Well, I never cared about sports until I met Lou, of course. But he never really followed baseball or football or any of that. Now, when St. Louis and Kansas City were in the playoffs for the World Series, he watched that. But other than that, he never really got involved. But he did remain friends with Stan and Joe and the whole gang. So my mother was thrilled.
It would be hard for Lou Thesz. It would be hard for as much traveling as Lou did for him to follow any other sport because, let's face it, we all know a superstar wrestler like that and the schedule he had as champion, how could he follow anything else? He's on the road all the time.
Yeah, and you had no evenings to watch TV or anything, or go to a game. You're right. It really
Did they
was
even have
difficult.
TV back then? Or?
Well, they did when I met him.
Forgive me. I'm not trying to be facetious.
That brings up a good question for me. How did you meet Lou?
Oh, this is I should be ashamed. I picked him up in a motel. I love to tell people that. I really did. I was the desk clerk at the motel, the Downtowner in St. Louis, in Nashville, Tennessee. And when he checked in, he asked for a queen-size bed. Of course, king-size beds were never heard of at that time. And I put him in a room with a queen-size bed. I didn't think anything else of it, and everybody went wild. Do you know who that is? And I kept saying, the guest in room 120. But I had never been to a wrestling match, had no clue. But he certainly was amazing. He was so quiet, and as all of you know, never acted like Dar, never expected special attention, but appreciated anything.
He always had a lot of dignity.
Yes, but he
Lou
appreciated kindness. He would say, "I thank you for your kindness." And, when people are just groveling at his feet, it was amazing to me.
Do you know, you have to meet Barbara Goodish. Have you ever heard the story of how she met Bruiser Brody? She was also a desk clerk at a hotel in Australia at the time, and she helped him out getting a room when he came in. And it's
same story.
Same story.
As you was telling me that, I thought I was sitting here talking to Barbara.
Yeah, same story. Barbara was telling me about this.
It was not my goal. And I just met with all of my high school friends, like 10 of us that went to high school together. And, of course, we're all old ladies now. Forgive me, girls. And they say I was the least expected to marry a professional wrestler.
I know my mother was always claiming that she was the least, she was kind of an articulate, urbane New Yorker, and somehow she inherited this wrestling business with cauliflower ears and all these strange characters, and my dad also had all these animals and stuff out here in Western Canada.
Listen, I remember going to their home, and I remember your mother saying to me, and not to be unkind, she was joking, I know. She said, "I know we have 12 kids, but I kept telling Stu, if we have just one more, we might get it right."
Unfortunately, I don't think they ever quite did get it right, but
she was so delightful. I mean, just the warmest, most wonderful. And I do have such great memories of being there.
She worshipped Lou. I remember when he was up for us in 81 or whatever, and I remember my mother telling Stu kind of ruefully, it's too bad today's wrestlers aren't anywhere near as classy and nice and all that as Lou, and she was kind of not pleased with the way they were becoming, but.
Well, now, Bruce, wasn't your mother's father an Olympic marathon runner, Harry Smith?
Oh, he was. He was oddly enough, he was roommate with the legendary native athlete Jim Thorpe on the ship. Back in those days, they didn't have airplanes and stuff. 1912 Olympics, and they were roommates on the ship over to Stockholm, Sweden, from New York. I think it took like 2 weeks or something. So they were good buddies. And my dad told me later on, Jim Thorpe refereed and did some kind of was kind of involved in some aspects of professional wrestling in the latter stages of his life, but I remember my dad, I guess, through my mother's father, met Jim Thorpe, and they shared some kind of perspectives and whatever. This would have been back in maybe the 40s, And
we got another question from the Old School Pro Wrestling group on Facebook. My good friend Scott Rogers is wondering if Lou ever wrestled Billy Riley or the Great Gama. I think maybe he wrestled Gama in India.
Yes, he did. Had no respect for Gama. They had some sort of an issue, and I apologize because I don't remember what it was.
Nor should
but I know.
I think Great Gama's been dead for about 100 years.
Well, but Lou had really negative, nothing good to say about the Great Gama.
I do. Yeah, Lou was negative. That was not one of his favorite people.
No. And neither was Toots Mott. Lou had no use for him. And Toots and Ed Lewis had been partners at one time. And Ed tried to get Lou to forgive Toots for whatever it was. Well, I do know what it was.
I was told, that Toots was a bit of a hard head, or he had a bit of an abrasive personality. And
Lou would say about Toots Mott, he would steal the cream out of your coffee. I mean, he really, I think it went back to Lou working in California in his really, really younger days and being abused in the pay envelope. And the attitude that Toots had with the boys, you know, like, you're here, you got no place to go, you'll take what I give you. And that just, there was no way he would ever forgive Toots. And when they were trying to arrange the match between Lou and Buddy Rogers, when Lou had the title, and Toots took Lou in the men's room. Lou said, how appropriate, and offered him an extra $25,000 from his own pocket for Lou to give the title to Buddy, and Lou just said, I don't think so. I mean, it was Lou he just disliked him. And a German-Hungarian, once you get on his bad side, just forget it. You're never going to get over it.
What was Lou's take on Buddy Rogers? You know, he's one of those guys that's a polarizing figure, as they say.
Poor Buddy made the fatal mistake one night when he and Lou were together, because Ed Strangler Lewis was refereeing their match. And, of course, Ed got a cut. And poor Buddy didn't have any better sense than to say to Lou, why do we have to share our money with that old has-been? Oh, poor Buddy. Now, Lou got over it. He, you know, eventually they were friendly. And I don't think Buddy ever knew what he did. That was the sad part.
That was part of that whole genre, I guess, Charlie, at that time, because NWA champions, for the most part at that time, were amateur types like Dick Hutton and Pat O'Connor and Lou. And my dad was a member of the NWA and all like that. And my dad knew Buddy from New Jersey. I think when my dad was working in New York in the 40s, he knew him, Herman Dutch Rohde or whatever is his real name. But beyond all that, he said Buddy had a bit of a reputation for either trying to do things his way, and he had kind of held up a few promoters, and so there's a few things that kind of further alienated him with the. My dad told me it was a huge issue within the NWA back in the late 50s, early 60s. With NWA champion, they always wanted it to be somebody that could actually wrestle, in case anybody tried to get cute, as my dad used to say.
So he could defend himself, exactly.
Yeah,
and Buddy Rogers could not.
Yeah, and for that reason, and then I know there was a few sub-issues with Buddy and some of these other old shooters that my dad knew, like Bill Miller and Carl Gotch, and I heard they had kind of roughed Buddy up in the dressing room, and maybe Columbus or somewhere like that. And but Buddy was kind of like the antithesis of from what my dad told me of what guys like Lou and Luther Liddy and George Gordienko and Dick Hutton and they're all, and even Vern Gagne, they were all pretty legit amateurs and had pretty solid backgrounds and reputations. But Buddy was not a wrestler, amateur wrestler at all. He was more of a showman type, and they had trouble respecting him or having him being put forth as the NWA World Champion. There's still, even after Buddy, most of the champions after that were like amateur guys or guys with legitimate backgrounds like Pat O'Connor and Jack Briscoe and even Dory Funk Jr. and them. They're all pretty legit as far as their amateur background.
From a St. Louis perspective, on a couple of those people you talked about, first of all, when he retired from the business, his wife, Alma, was a St. Louis lady, and he moved to St. Louis. So back in that era of about 1973, 74, 75, Tootsmont would start hanging around our office in St. Louis. And, of course, as Sam would tell me then, he'd say, no use burning bridges. You never know what's going to happen. Sometimes you burn a bridge And the person that you like today is the person you hate tomorrow. The person you hate today is the person you like tomorrow. But he told me stories about Mont, too. And he said, yeah, Toots was an operator. And he always thought that when Vince McMahon Sr. broke away with Buddy Rogers as the champion, it wasn't really Vince Sr. who was doing the manipulating behind the scenes. It was Toots Mont.
Oh, yeah,
So,
he was, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of that was Toots. I have to admit, at least from my perspective, because by then he was out of the business, he'd sit around that office either with Sam and me or with Wild Bill Longson and me, and I just sit there and listen. There were some really great stories about how he manipulated things, and I could see that he was not somebody you'd want to trust if you were doing business with him. By the same token, when it comes to Buddy Rogers, and again, I'll use Sam's perspective on this, he said Rogers was a jerk, but he could draw money.
Well, what I always loved about Lou's perspective on the wrestling business is he never, even though he did go into other businesses, he never believed that other businesses had the same level of SOBs and backstabbers that the wrestling business did. You know, like in the hotel industry, you wouldn't ever have anybody that would try to cheat you. It was hysterical.
Lou was a special kind of character. You could see it when he walked to the ring. You could see it when he walked in. He just looked professional. He looked believable. He looked like a champion of whatever area it was. And I can
always
remember
the same, just the black. I remember always just the black robe, the black boots, the black tights. I don't recall Lou ever wearing like sequins or, you know.
No, not a sequins guy. No, definitely not.
Sunglasses or, you know, wasn't. It didn't have tassels on his arms and you know.
He never tried painting his face even once. Unbelievable.
You mean he never came out to music?
No, he never did. Nope.
No frills, and I think my dad said that he didn't need any. You know, he had this majesty about him. You know, and the only thing that he ever wore beyond that into the ring was the world title belt. You know, and my dad said when Lou came to the ring, he'd have it around his waist. You know, nowadays you see these guys have it slung over their shoulder or whatever. You know. And he said Lou had this sort of majesty about him, where he'd have that iconic black and gold world title belt, and there's an aura or a majesty about it. You know, and I don't see anything like that. I haven't seen that for years, and amongst the. You know, some of today's champions could probably learn a lesson or two by watching some old YouTube video of Lou Thesz coming to the ring. You know, and this is the way you should do it. You know, you don't need.
Yeah, I think all those young guys out there who claim to be professional wrestlers and aren't drawing a dime or getting over anywhere should maybe try to figure out why Lou Thesz could walk out in a pair of black trunks and get over and sell tickets, and they put on glittery robes and face paint and do 450 splashes, and they aren't drawing a dime. I think there needs to be a little reflection in those young people out there as to why it's not working for them.
Yeah, it might be a great tutorial or, you know, kind of insight into maybe how to get over in this business and instill some respect and whatever amongst the fans for the business too.
You can't teach charisma. They either have it or they don't. When Lou Thesz walked to the ring, you knew he was a champion. When Jack Briscoe walked into the ring, you knew he was a champion. You can't teach certain things.
They have to find their own way. They have to find who they are. Lou knew who he was.
Lou didn't have to watch TV on Monday night to figure out who he was as a wrestler.
No. Or as a person. That was the amazing part.
Who was Lou as a person? That's a great question. You know, we talk about people's accomplishments in the ring a lot, but seldom do we actually talk about who they were as individuals outside the ring. What was Lou Thesz like as a man?
He was a very thoughtful, somewhat impatient, considerate person. And I think the thing I loved the most about him was when he met someone, he judged them by how well they did whatever they had chosen to do, not by how much money they made or if they were highly respected in their field. And he respected someone for doing the very best at what they chose to do. And I just think that's a lesson we can all take. We admire people who've made all this money, and but you find that those people, money was not their objective. What their objective was doing something to the best of their ability, finding something they were really good at. And that was one of the things I loved the most about him. But he was very, very considerate. Such a gentleman. I think my brother said it best. He was 8 years older and, of course, just flabbergasted that his baby sister was dating the Lou Thesz. He said, the Lou Thesz? I said, Johnny is the only one I know. I mean, I don't know if it's the Lou Thesz or not. But it was Christmas. Lou was with his kids, and I was with my brother and his family. And my brother was setting up the Lone Ranger, and he looked at me and he looked at the Lone Ranger, and he said, meeting Lou was like meeting the Lone Ranger. And I just thought that was one of the nicest compliments, because the Lone Ranger was such a good guy, and so was Lou. Lou respected everyone he met until they gave him a reason not to. And
yeah.
I don't think a lot of people do that. We tend to be judgmental about people until they prove themselves. But Lou was never like that. He respected everyone and assumed everyone was straightforward until they proved they weren't. Now, when they proved they weren't, it was not pretty. He was not forgiving, like with Too Smart. But he just, from the get-go, gave you the ultimate chance to be who he thought you were.
Lou always seemed to be very modest and never, very rarely putting himself over.
No.
If you didn't know beforehand who he was, you'd have never suspected. This is like one of the most iconic, respected figures in the history of our sport. You'd have no idea, because he certainly wouldn't be telling you. Very rarely do I ever hear him saying "I this" or "I that." He's pretty humble and modest, and that may have been one more reason why he was as good as he was.
How was the relationship between Lou and Harley Race?
It was good, and I've wondered whether I should tell this story or not. But Larry's on the phone, and I don't know if he's ever heard it. But years ago, Harley was booking for Baba, I think, and Lou was coming in for Larry into St. Louis. And Harley called Lou and told Lou if he came in for Larry, Harley would make sure Lou was never booked in Japan again. And I remember this like it was yesterday. Lou sat there and he listened to Harley, and he didn't laugh, which is what I probably would have done. And he said, Harley, I understand your position, but Larry Matysek is a good friend of mine, and I've given him my word, so you're just going to have to do what you have to do. And I will never forget that. And I always, after that, of course, Lou always forgave. I never did. That just annoyed me about Harley, that he would do that. And of course, Lou did go back to Japan.
What year was, or what time period was this? Like 70s or something? Or?
I don't know, Larry. When you were promoting and Harley was promoting.
Yeah, 1983. And actually, Lou told me one other Japanese story. I know the one that you just told, and you may have told it to me actually before Lou did. But there was another situation on the bus in Japan where Harley talked to Brody and told Brody if he came in for me that they'd have to settle it. He kept kind of trying to push Brody around a little bit, which was the wrong thing. And finally, Brody said, "Stop the bus. Let's get off the bus, and we're going to settle this once and for all."
Oh, my gosh.
And they did not stop. Harley would not get out. They did not, for all Harley's talk. And I respect Harley. I like Harley. I had a lot of time with him. But they never made peace on it. The bus kept rolling. Now, what really made me, I'd heard that story from somebody else first. What really made me believe that story was true was when Lou told me the story, when Lou Thesz told me the story, because Lou had been on the bus too. And he says, no, Brody told him, he says, stop the bus. This is going to get settled right now. We're going to get off the bus. If you got a problem with me, we're going to settle it now. And Harley didn't want to get off the bus and settle it.
That is so funny. I mean, I can see that. I can see that in my mind. But what amazed me is Lou never got angry with Harley or said, "Are you kidding me? You know, you think you could keep me from being booked in Japan?" But no, he never said anything like that. He was very calm, and he respected Harley's position, and he just explained to him, kind of like Harley was a 10-year-old kid, that this is the way the world works. And, you know, Larry's a friend of mine, and he said, "Harley, you just have to do what you have to do."
Tell me, Charlie, what was Lou's take or perspective of Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk later on?
That was a tough situation, and I held a grudge for a long, long time. But it's like Jerry Briscoe said, Terry Funk is a hard guy not to like. So, you know, I've kind of gotten, but they were supposed to go to Kuwait with Lou, and then the last minute they backed out. And it just really infuriated me. Of course, Lou said, "Honey, it's business." And I just, you know, kept my butt on my shoulders for years and years and years over that, because it did hurt Lou, because he raised those boys. I mean, you know, he not raised them, but he was around them when they were growing up. And for them to double crossing like that.
I heard that he was a huge influence on them back in the, maybe as
and
far back as the 60s.
Loved their dad. Loved their dad. So when they did that, to him, I swore I would never forgive them. And, oh, gosh, I held that grudge for a long time. But like Jerry Briscoe says, Terry Funk is a hard guy not to like. I do love him, you know, and, of course, that was a long time ago. And
really great.
Lou kept saying, honey, you know, it's business. Well, it wasn't business to me. When Lou says his feelings were hurt, that was not business. That was war, as far as I was concerned. But, you know, it wasn't that way for Lou. But he really... Did he mention who?
Gene Kiniski. They were pretty good buddies, weren't they?
Loved Gene, and what he liked the most about Gene, although he wasn't a wrestler, Lou said every time you wrestled with Gene, he wanted to learn something. You know, he had something in his mind that he wanted to be taught. He wanted to learn about wrestling. And Johnny Valentine was another one that Lou really respected because of that. He said Johnny was the toughest guy he ever met.
They always spoke very reverentially, almost kind of, you know. They always told me they were sort of humbled to be considered friends of Lou Kiniski and Valentine. You know, they seemed to hold him almost like he was sort of like a god or on a higher level than them. But,
and both the boys are just incredible. Kelly, I knew much
and
more.
Nick.
But I don't know that I ever met Nick, but I did Kelly, and just what
he was a nice kid.
Oh,
he was a good friend of the Funks, Kelly. He actually started up here in the early 80s and seemed like a very nice kid.
Gene was a character. I mean, a character. And
yeah, a lot more soft-spoken than Gene. You know, Kelly, not almost like polar opposites.
Well, everyone is more soft-spoken than Gene was. I mean,
yeah.
Let's be real.
Oh, yeah.
You guys mentioned earlier about people who didn't get a good chance because of wrestling changing, especially when McMahon got in charge. And the one that really hurt was Nick Kiniski, because I saw Nick when he worked for McMahon there a little bit, about 84, 85-ish, whatever
Somewhere
it was.
in there, yeah.
Yeah, and when I saw Nick, believe me, if Nick could have come in the right time, I guarantee if he'd have come into St. Louis in the mid-'70s, late 70s, Nick Kiniski would have been a star. He was, how would we say this, attempted to be seduced by certain people within the business on the WWF side. They made a sexual advance toward him, and Nick couldn't take that and said he was going home.
I often wondered, I usually hear most of the scuttlebutt within the business, but I hadn't heard that. I remember Brett telling me he thought Nick Kiniski was a great prospect, and I often wondered, geez, what happened? He seemed to just fall by the wayside,
Well, he's still. Last I heard, he's still in the Vancouver area, runs a bar.
Now, Charlie, did Lou ever bring up the Carpentier controversy with the world title?
I am trying to think. That was with, who was it that the Carpentier was working for?
Eddie Quinn in Montreal. He was sort of like Carpentier's.
Okay, that's what. Yeah, okay, that was. Yeah,
Eddie
that was
Quinn's
with
big French-Canadian star up there, even though he was Polish.
Yes. And did they want Lou to give the title to him? Was that the issue?
Yeah, the deal there where they wanted him to give the title, and so they did a count out of the ring, and then an injury thing where he couldn't come back. He got counted out of the ring for one fall, and then couldn't come back for the final fall because his back had been injured. Therefore, Carpentier claimed the title based on Eddie Quinn's push. And Eddie Quinn got in.
It sounded like some kind of shady stuff. And my dad told me Eddie Quinn was a bit of a gangster type too.
Oh, Eddie Quinn was a gangster, but he was Lou's gangster. Lou adored Eddie Quinn. I think
my dad said he knew Eddie in Boston before he ever went up to Montreal.
Oh my gosh, Lou would tell Eddie Quinn stories until I would be in tears with laughter. I mean, he just thought Eddie Quinn, and this was something else that I found out. I met Lou in Nashville, and Lou came in for Nick Goulas, which of course was not the best promoter in the world. And Lou said, as I learned, what some of it was all about, he said the only reason that Nick brought him in because he was having problems, and he knew that Lou had a mob connection because of Eddie Quinn. And, of course, Eddie Quinn had been dead for years. Lou didn't know any of those people, but he just let Nick think that. But I just thought that was so funny. But he would tell me Eddie Quinn stories, they were just wonderful. And Coogie McFarland that worked for Eddie Quinn, oh, my gosh. It just makes me wish I'd known these people. But I feel like I did. That they were so alive in Lou's life.
History, according to WWE, is that essentially Lou Thesz's refusal to drop the NWA world title to Vern Gagne is what created the AWA. What was the relationship between Lou and Vern actually like?
Lou was ambivalent about Vern. I mean, it's one thing to be hated, but don't we just hate to be ignored? And that was kind of the way Lou felt about Vern. There was a lot of contention about the museum, but now I never heard that Lou refused to drop the title to Vern. I knew he refused to drop the title to Buddy.
My dad told me Vern was frankly perceived to be too small to be the heavyweight champion.
Such an egomaniac. I mean,
like my dad told me Vern was the junior heavyweight champ, but
Yes.
said he was at his prime, maybe 210.
That's what I heard from Muchnick, too. So if you put all three of us, what you heard from Lou, what I heard from Sam, what you heard from your dad, I think we pretty much had. They just didn't feel that Vern Gagne had what it took to be the world champion. In fact, that was the time when they picked Pat O'Connor, and O'Connor just had a better look than Vern, I guess is what it came down to. And O'Connor could wrestle as well as Vern, too.
And there was a lot of apprehension, too,
tough.
that Vern was, being sort of part of the promotion and in Minneapolis as well, that it kind of compromised his ability to go around and be a world champion and do what was good for all the different NWA promotions. That was kind of a bit of a conflict of interest.
I want to make sure to remind all the fans listening out there that you can pick up Hooker and Authentic Wrestlers' Adventures Inside the Bizarre World of Professional Wrestling, Lou Thesz's autobiography, which is available at crowbarpress.com. And I also want to suggest you check out Brody, The Triumph and Tragedy of Wrestling's Rebel, which is a book by Barbara Goodish and Larry Matisak, which is available on Amazon. And I want to thank all the fine gentlemen at the Old School Pro Wrestling Lives group on Facebook for submitting so many wonderful questions for us here today.
Thank you, guys. Nothing I love better than talking about Lou.
And I'd like to thank Herb and Larry for coming on, and Johnny Mantell, and, of course, our co-host Matt Merz for joining us this afternoon here on Hart Beat Radio.
Thank you so much.